Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade. So I made a video a couple of months ago about all the uninvestable second and third tier TCGs that are out there these days. Games like Star Wars and One Piece and MetaZoo and other versions of MetaZoo and Lorcana and all these other ones. And, it really upset a couple of people who had their kind of sacred cows gored by saying that the games that they loved were uninvestable. But, the reality is there's an incredibly long history of dead TCGs, and a lot of the second and third tier games today will wind up being dead TCGs one day. And the reality is that when there are no players there to keep buying the product, the prices plummet and the returns are very, very bad. Now, I got an opportunity to follow that up today, and this is going to be fun. I was out just browsing around on eBay, and I went over to P Football Pete, who is one of the biggest, probably the biggest Magic dealer on eBay. And I was just scrolling down the first page of his results, and I kept noticing something, these old games. Products from all these old TCGs, and then I started investigating them, and what I realized is a lot of them have inventory labels and sticker prices on them from apparently a place called Oxford Comics. So it appears as if this Oxford Comics store has gone out of business or just sold out all this old inventory to them, and P Football Pete has listed it up on his eBay page, and man, is it a smorgasbord of old defunct card games from the 90s and the early 2000s. So we're going to have some fun here. We're going to look at some of these old games. We're going to talk about what we see, how hilariously low effort some of them look, and some of the reasons why some of today's second and third tier games, in fact, most of them will join these games eventually. And so I put here at the beginning Wyvern. And of course, Wyvern is one that you've probably heard of. I actually came into contact with this when I was a kid. I mean, that's how widespread this one was. It's pretty well known. Rudy has done a couple of videos about Wyvern over the years. I think he opened part of a booster box at one point. And yeah, Wyvern's in here. It's just one from the late 90s. And we've got, oh boy, Deadlands. So Deadlands was a cowboy-themed one, kind of a Wild West theme. And this is one that I believe I remember, or at least I remember seeing ads for this in, what were the magazines at the time? There was Scryer, and there was something else. I forget. There was a second magazine. I had subscriptions to those for a while in the late 90s, and yeah, I remember seeing these kind of things. So a stack of probably starter decks for Deadlands. And some of these, we can look around on them and find dates. I don't care enough to actually go look up all of these, but some of them will have dates on them, easier to find than others. Now, Legend of the Five Rings, this one was actually cool. And if you want a rabbit hole of interesting reading, go look up the history of this game. The designers had the idea that what happened in the large tournaments would affect the storyline in the game and thus affect what cards would be made later on. It was a really cool idea, but I mean, like most TCGs, it failed. Netrunner, this is another one that I came into contact with, or at least saw advertised at the time as a kid, and probably not enough details, not enough pictures, or good enough resolution to pick out a date on this one. Well, there, he listed a date right there, 1996. And Blood Wars. Now, this is getting into ones that I had never heard of. And let's see, can we see a date here? 1995 TSR. Wow, TSR. They sue regularly. So, Blood Wars, another one I've never heard of. Now, I actually played the MechWarrior themed one, and it had those little metal washer counters that came with it. I remember we had a card game club for a couple of years in high school, and I played that there a couple of times. I can't remember the name of it. G.I. Joe, of course, made famous by Logan Paul a few years ago. We have a date on when this came around, 2004 on the listing. So, yep, 2004. Think of that, 2004, and a game tied into an incredibly popular IP, and it failed. Yep. Well, that's going to be a recurring theme here. IP games actually have a higher hill to climb than games that are creating their own IP. And the reason is Mark Hamill only ever wore so many outfits as Luke Skywalker. And so you only have so many different looks. You only have Tatooine Luke Skywalker and Hoth Luke Skywalker and Endor Luke Skywalker and several more, but eventually you run out. And you run out of in-universe vehicles and characters and events and everything else that you can use for the game. And as the maker of the TCG based on the IP, you do not have the liberty to expand the IP. And that is fundamentally the biggest problem with IP tie-in games. And it's why when we get to some of the Star Wars games, yes, there were many. When we get to the Star Wars games, I'm going to elaborate on that more. Shadowrun. Now, we had Netrun before. This is Shadowrun. 1997, it says on the listing. And this is another one that I can remember from the time. I never played it, but at least the fact that it existed as a game is something that I remember. And I guess we have these like orcs, and we have technology and like a city and kind of a mashup. Hey, at least it's not the normal high fantasy like 2 out of every 3 TCGs. Harry Potter. Now, this should have been sometime into the early 2000s. It's probably here where it's blurry. In fact, that may be it there if it's not an address for Warner Brothers. But this should have been sometime early 2000. My recollection is Harry Potter kind of took off around 2003 or 4, something like that. Genio Marvel. Now, looking at this, I couldn't quite tell. I don't think this is actually a real TCG. I think it's some kind of like challenge card game thing from the wording here on the back, but I did take a couple of minutes to read it. 2003, but I can virtually guarantee none of you have ever heard of this. Shadow Fist, 1995. Man, back there in the really heady days when Magic was blowing up, and everybody said, hey, what if I throw a card game out there into the world? Oh, so we got ninjas and we got guns. Yeah, a Japanese-themed card game. That could be kind of cool. I mean, cool kind of theming if you set it in kind of a modern-day Japan. Everyone could be old and sad and not having kids. Here we go, One Piece. One of the earlier One Piece card games. Yep. One Piece is eventually going to close down. The boxes, if you are unfortunate enough to be hoarding them, they will drop in price considerably and really won't be a great investment going into the future. So you will have missed the opportunity, and just the reality that Bandai has done One Piece card games in the past, abandoned them, and then started it again. You should have some hesitation. But again, this comes back to the IP tie-in problem. What do we have here? Shaolin Showdown. Now, I kind of have a recollection that Shaolin Showdown was a cartoon in the late 90s. That sounds familiar, but I had no idea that they had a game. Can we see a date on here anywhere? I don't see one. But yeah, late 90s is my recollection. It's interesting how many of these different sets show that they were printed by Wizards of the Coast. We ought to have a date somewhere here on the back. Oh well, I don't see it, but late 90s is kind of what I remember with this thing. And there it is, 2005, right there above my cursor. 2005, so a bit later than I would have guessed. But yeah, Wizards of the Coast was heavily involved in a lot of early TCGs. Oh boy, Star Wars 2007 WizKids Pocket Model TCG game. I guess this is a card game mixed with models that kind of move on a board. Now, something I warned of in videos earlier this year was Star Wars has had 7 or 8 or 9 abandoned TCGs over the last 30 years. That's why I have zero faith in the current Star Wars TCG. Eventually, they're going to run through all the big hit locales, the big hit events, the big hit vehicles and characters, and which shirt they wore and which pair of pants and which jacket. and they're going to run out of stuff. Interest will wane, and they will abandon the current card game just like they did this one, just like they did this one, and many more. Again, it was 7 or 8 or 9 over the years. Can we pull a date off of this? Yeah, another Wizards of the Coast. It's interesting that they were involved. Yeah, 2002 Lucasfilm on this one. What do we have here? Decipher Wars, TCG Nowhere to Hide booster box. Oh man, the lobotomy haircut. Man, I didn't know it was around then in 2005. I thought it was a more modern travesty. So we have, I don't know, looks like future tech. Maybe that's a mech. There's some starships. Again, you know, the kind of future sci-fi and the high fantasy tend to be the most common themes for these games. And I really wish more designers, if you're designing a TCG, take a risk on some other setting. Yep, 2005 is what it says on this box. Psycore. Babylon 5. Okay, Babylon 5. And that was probably late 90s. 1999 on this box. Yep, IP tie-ins. They don't have long lives. What do we have? Case closed. 2005. One Truth Prevails trading card game. Hey, maybe at least that was kind of some novel ideas in how you could build a deck and play a game. If there's some kind of mystery element and that's how you're competing, unless it's just silly the way Lorcana is like, you're trying to capture pieces of art or whatever, and your opponent still has 20 life points and you still attack him, so it's still basically Magic. So as long as it's not just a lame reskin like Lorcana is, it could be cool to have some actual novel ideas on how to build these things and play the games. Cult. Reality is a lie. Oxford Comics. $2.95 booster packs. And I know some people are going to say, but Craig, the box is $400. Yes, and if you had held it from the time you bought it from distribution at $70, you would be very, very sad with that return. I looked at this one earlier and could not find a date anywhere. Pretty plain packaging, just white booster packs. They should have put some kind of texture printed on there behind that, just to make it look more interesting. Dragon Booster, TCG. Man, if you could not be a more lame ripoff of Pokemon. 10 additional cards, no purchase necessary. Wait, was there a sweepstakes? Why is there no purchase necessary? That's the point of all of this. Purchases are necessary. First edition, I'm willing to bet there was not a second edition. You know, you've really got to ask yourself, amongst other things, if you're designing a TCG, how are you going to get into stores? And you can see these long histories of dead games where stores wasted money buying these products and ultimately just had to eat the cost and hold them for years and years and years. And you've got to convince store owners that you're worthy of getting into the store, and then once you're in the store, you've got to convince the players that they should risk money on your game, and somebody's got to be the first man to hit the beach. They have to be the first person at the local store to buy some cards and hope someone else buys some cards to sit down and jam games with them. Call of the Cord, 2009. Oh man, it's pretty late. Pretty late. Is this based on an IP or is this its own thing? I've never heard of this before. Not many pictures either. Blood Wars. I think we did this one earlier. Man, I'm telling you, there were so many of these listed. I just had to stop. I had to stop because I thought I was going to crash my computer with how many tabs I was opening. Call of Cthulhu. Now, of course, Call of Cthulhu, the RPG, is very popular. You know, the whole, like, genre of, you know, this kind of horror is really popular, but can you translate it to a card game? That's kind of difficult. It's the reason that cosmic horror as a visual medium is very difficult. Because the whole idea of cosmic horror is that some of the elements are so horrific that if you see them, you'll go crazy. And so putting that into any type of visual medium is kind of difficult. It's why maybe like the movie Bird Box on Netflix, Sandra Bullock, it's about 5 or 6 years old now. That was a cosmic horror film, and they kind of approached it through the method of having the characters be blindfolded so they could never see the horrors. And that kind of made it work. I mean, it wasn't a particularly scary movie or anything, but in the sense of trying to translate cosmic horror into a visual medium, it worked a bit. I think I see 2005 right there on this box. Oh boy, Star Trek. But Star Trek's popular. How could it ever fail? Yeah, well. Now, is this actually a TCG or is this just a collector box? Yeah, I don't think this is actually a TCG. Yeah, I think these are just it's a hobby box. Okay. Dagger Isle. Okay, maybe have some some mystery and some kind of suspense elements and action and fighting undead and stuff like that. Okay, at least it's a tiny bit different than the regular kind of high fantasy that consumes everything else. What is this? Chili extravaganza? What kind of weirdo puts recipes in their TCG content? Man, that's wild. So, I can't really get a date on this of when it failed. I'm sure it was right after launch, but what do we have here? Marvel Recharge 2 collectible card game. Yep, another time you farm out the IP. 2002 on this one. You farm out the IP and, well, there's only so much you can do with it. Now, 2002, that was when they really were kicking up and starting some of the superhero movies. I remember one of the Spider-Man films came out in 2002. Highlander. But Craig, everybody in the 90s loved Highlander. How could a Highlander TCG fail? Yeah, because most TCGs fail. I don't see dates on this. Swordmaster game system. So this is something, if it's what it appears to be, this is something that a lot of TCGs tried to do in the 90s. They'd come up with a game system and then they would basically just skin IPs onto that game system. And so you could have, there was a system where you could have Terminator, you had Aliens and Predator all in the same system and several others. I know there are RPG games even today that do the same thing. They have a single system and then they'll make expansion books that are, Spider-Man universe skinned onto that system or Rambo universe or whatever. Rage CCG booster pack box. Can we get a date? It's going to be tough. Pretty low resolution on that picture. On the Edge. Oh man. It's like the puppet and he's controlling the puppet master. Oh man. Do we have a date? Yeah, see, this is a really bad design. Like, I can't tell what this game is about or what the setting is. I mean, maybe it's kind of trying to be that, like, weird, ambiguous kind of setting like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, where it's kind of a mix of a lot of different things. Oh boy, they definitely had a late 1990s clip art album to make this kind of stuff. Yeah. Man, the clip art is heavy with this one. Yeah, I can't tell anything about this game. I'm sure if you tried to piece together the words here, you could maybe tell something. No writing on the bottom, so can't get a date on that, but boy does that scream late 90s. Imagination Dual Voice of the Storm's first edition sealed booster. Who knows? Who knows? Never heard of it. Are there any dates? Approximately 1 to 55 cards? Oh, 1 in 55 cards. Okay, I see. They're giving the odds of something special there on the back. No, I don't see a date. Maybe it's in there somewhere. Arcadia King, The Wild Hunt. Yep. More games that no one has ever heard of. that probably failed right out of the gate. It's an unbelievable, brutal industry. And the reality is, you have to build these games into a network. And when you're starting, your network doesn't exist. You've got to build it up from there. And then you look at games like Magic. And, one of the elements of the network is the rule system, just the rule system itself. And Magic has the best rule system. There are very few flaws in Magic's rule system because they've had 30 years to tune it and fix things. They have the limited environment. They have all these ways of managing how cumbersome the rules seem to be, but keeping the game fun. And I don't understand why more people don't do what Lorcana did and just rip off Magic's rule system. And what's really funny is the worst part of Magic's rule system is land, because you always have Mana Screw and Mana Flood, and it really is the weakest part of Magic's rule system. And Lorcana was like, yeah, let's get rid of that part. 1995, Pioneer, Animayhem, get it? It's a pun. The Anime CG Booster Box. So I guess this 1995's version of all of the waifu card games we have now, where they have the thinnest veneer of a game over top of just scantily clad waifus. Metabots. Boy, another one I've never heard of. Trading card game. This looks like any random late 90s cartoon that was ported over from Japan. God, we had so many of those back then. Look for powerful rare cards. Yeah, that's kind of the point. 1999, though. Warhammer 40k collectible card game. And yet, here we are. Starter bricks. Abandoned in the back of the Oxford comic store for decades until they were sold off. Hercules. Oh boy. Man, the Hercules TV show from the late 90s with Kevin Sorbo. 1998, Wizards of the Coast. I'm pretty sure there's got to be a Xena card game to go next to this. Man, a product like this really never had a chance. It just never had a chance. The possible lifetime this card game could have served would have been so short. Oh, man. Anyone seeing the date on this? 1998. There it is. It's okay, guys. We only have a couple more. Inuyasha. Yeah, I remember. I guess I remember it was a TV show. I never watched it. I don't know anything about it. 2000. 2005. So we'll go 2005 on this one. Yep. Man. More games. Abandoned. The Umbra. How many of these games have any of you guys ever actually heard of? Yeah, the first couple, the Wild West one and Wyvern and a couple others, Legend of the Five Rings. Those were some of the ones that were actually big enough in the 90s that, man, you might actually see the cards. Your friends at school might have some of them. Limited edition supplement for Rage. Okay, so this is just a expansion for the Rage card game. My bad. Wildstorms, the expandable superhero CCG starter deck box. Yeah. So this is the last one we're going to look at, but, it's important to keep in mind that there is no accounting for how many of these games have failed over the years. How many of the games have probably been printed and distributors wouldn't take them? Imagine that. I bet there's tons of those where someone paid to get a company to print the game and then no distributor was even interested in taking it. Imagine how many of those are out there. And then games that just never left the drawing board to eventually get to a printer. This kind of stuff is hard. Making games is really hard. And the CCG world is even more difficult because of those network effects. Because you need a place to go play. You need people to play with. It's not like a board game where you can buy a copy of, this year's newest, crappiest board games, and you and a friend can both get irritated wasting your time on them. And so these games are a lot harder to get off the ground. And nowadays, it's easier than ever to get a game published. There's companies that exist to do nothing but publish your wild game that you came up with that hasn't had enough play testing, that probably won't make it, or certainly won't make it. And so there's more and more of these kind of games coming to market all the time. And that's why I caution people that jumping in on the new games is ultra, ultra dangerous. And, I've talked about Flesh and Blood in the past. And man, Flesh and Blood, they did everything right. And they still had to get unbelievably lucky to make it the way they have. And they did everything right. They executed perfectly. And it still took an unbelievable amount of luck for them to have done what they've done. And, the reality is, all of these current IP tie-in games, they'll all be abandoned at some point. All the waifu games, better waifus will come along. Nobody plays the waifu games. So you're going to have more and more things like Girlfriend Story come along where, hey, the chase cards are nude waifus. And, people will jump ship for that. Instead of your IP tie-in waifus where the IP companies don't want to be associated with you if you're putting nude cards in the packs too. So, the waifu games are incredibly, incredibly risky. The IP tie-in games are risky. And just new TCGs in general are risky. But it's really hard to keep that in mind because unless you're out there seeing things like this, like all these old games sitting here rotting for decades, it's hard to tell that so many games have come before and have all failed. And so it's also the reason why when Magic hits a low point like it did in 22 and 23, and everybody was saying Magic is dead, oh boy, it was not dead. It was nowhere close to dead. Cynthia Williams tried as hard as she could to destroy Magic, and even then, all she could do was just make things rough for a few years because the Magic network is so incomprehensibly large and powerful. And that's the hard thing to visualize. It's the hard thing to keep in mind. It's the hard thing to see. So keep that in mind, guys. And all the new games, very, very risky, and why I stay away. Let me know what you think, guys. Thanks to everyone who makes this content possible, especially my very generous supporters on Patreon. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade.